You're listening to This Week in America with Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America online, thisweekinamerica.us. It's been called a nuanced view of world politics and its elusive quest for world peace. The much talked about book Perspective, the Golden Rule from author David Meakes, who explores the folly of war and the rewards of pursuing peace. He knows this firsthand as a World War II veteran. During that time, he realized war does not bring about peace, it actually suppresses it. Perspective, the Golden Rule is a sweeping semi-autobiographical account that takes us through the chronology of David from his formative years through his participation for 5 years in World War II and a subsequent 22 years of continuing wars. David is a Canadian-born World War II veteran. He's 96 years old, a retired podiatrist, one son, one granddaughter living in Mesa, Arizona. David Meakes, the author of Perspective, the Golden Rule, is with us on This Week in America. David, welcome to the program, sir. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Rick. Appreciate it.
The book is just a fascinating read that everybody should read. In the book, you express great anguish at the exploding military debt linked to the nation's blind acceptance of war and the money pit known as national security, where our education, health, and social welfare dollars are squandered. Please comment on what you meant by this.
Well, first of all, this urgent commentary about our nation's future needs is my life's most important message, so I hope you listen kind of closely. But for understanding, it requires a review of how we got to where we are now. And up front, I'd first like to state that, in my view, our military forces are an essential part of the realistic protective needs that our country requires. But that this account is also about much that is unrealistic. In 1960, packing it mostly into one paragraph, President Dwight Eisenhower gave us the wise but ominous early warning to beware of the then 13-year-old MIC. That's the military-industrial complex. It is complex. So for understanding, please concentrate and follow closely. The following is my simplistic explanation of why he called it a complex and why we must seriously worry about it now. Right now, Wikipedia reports that we have over 800 military bases outside our borders, while hanging over us is today's military debt, part by possibly fatal national debt, and is increasing by about $94,000 every minute. Those facts, the dictionary definition of militarism as being a nation with a large military establishment, confirms that the United States is a militaristic nation. The actions of the brutally evil Nazis in World War II justified the money spent, the lives lost, and the futures on hold. Wars should be fought for only humanitarian golden rule reasons or to defend our treasured democratic ideals. But our wars in Vietnam, Kuwait, and Iraq have primarily been fought for money, international supremacy, corporate viability, and oil. They have produced multi-trillion-dollar military debts and robbed us and our children of those tax dollars that should have instead been used for schools, hospitals, education, medical care, and infrastructure. For our survival, it is crucially important to understand that the military-industrial complex is tax money dependent. Its origin lies in the wording of the National Security Act signed by President Harry Truman in 1947. The prior Department of War was renamed the Department of Defense. Words sound deceptively unimportant, but they describe the profound psychological change that occurred. Our national philosophy of war management changed from watching, waiting, and avoiding war to instead planning for war, profiting from our military sales and making our military forces into a threatening world cop. The National Security Act meant that we would no longer wait for war and then pay for it. We would instead plan for war, needed or not, and pay for it whenever. Historian Daniel Yergin noted that the nation was to be permanently prepared, and Americans' interests and responsibilities were unrestricted and global. The military-industrial complex interpreted the National Security Act as No need to have a current or even a future enemy. We will just promote the idea of a safe, secure, impregnable America, and then we will provide it, and using fear, proclaim it, and sell it to the public and Congress as needed security or as preparedness. So the words national security came into daily use. Historian Stephen Beschloss quoted this expansive thinking as what brought us the 11 aircraft carrier strike groups when no other nation had more than one. The example of overspending. Follow the MPUGO acronym spelling, please. The idea of national security was new, and the military business world merging into the military-industrial complex was delighted. Bringing their vital jobs, their profitable futures were assured. The dreaded return of the Great Depression faded because we were now in the job-producing defense world of the future. The ogre of war, money-making MPUGO rejoiced. MPUGO is my acronym for Eisenhower's 1960 MIT, the military-industrial complex. These are the primary acronym entities and why they benefit from more. Please follow the MPUGO acronym spelling. Military personnel were now happy with their jobs, which would now be secure, respected, well-paid, lifelong jobs. The industries of war were now happy with their reliable, consistent profits. The politicians were now happy with their contented and employed voters. The unions and all workers were now happy with their secure jobs. The government was now happy with the larger taxation income from workers, corporations, and universities. The universities were now happy with their routine research, development, and teaching contracts. However, MPUGO soon found out that when the congressional flow of taxpayer money for the impregnable America military products stalled, it could now be lubricated by the sales skill of the burgeoning lobby industry. So now providing re-election funds for congressional members became a deductible promotional natural for MPUGO. Now, feeling obligated for the donations from the arms dealers, congressional members now made military appropriations their top priorities. MPUGO had just grown its seventh intertwining tentacle. MPUGO plus one, the connected, interdependent, money circulating complex, was now complete. With greater intensity in 2019, 72 years later, that is precisely what is still going on. Pointless military expenses of today, January the 3rd, 2019, are that the United States is pointlessly assisting the Saudis in the Crown Prince bin Salman's war in Yemen, where 85,000 children have died of war-related starvation. Disregarding inflicting suffering on the innocent, the President Trump's stated reason for helping them is a grateful appreciation for their very large purchases of American military equipment, thus maintaining the United States as the largest arms dealer in the world. As is frequently true, money is our reason to fight. Our military personnel neither know about it nor profit from it. Back in 1947, the World War II, fear of the Nazis, the fascists, and the Japanese was gone. But fear was still necessary to justify the tax money flow for a viable future military force. So our need for a new threatening, terrifying enemy was neatly filled by the Soviet Russia, our politically distasteful but devastated, debilitated, and still defensive World War II ally. The U.S. Department of Defense only had to search the globe for scary places of communist influence, where our now professional military could hone their skills and test MPUGO's upgraded defense of you folks a long way back home. Those scary remote countries soon came with names like Korea, Vietnam, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Applying to them all was author Noam Chomsky's quotation: "The American invasion of Vietnam was called defense even when we were wiping out the population." And ignoring appropriate taxes, the military debt was steadily increasing. In 1947, that massive conceptual and organizational change needed a focused leader. President Truman named former businessman and former Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal to become the first Secretary of the Department of Defense. To his new job, Forrestal brought his long experience, his expertise, his driving genius, his longtime friend Paul Nitze, and his obsessive, agonizing, paranoid dread of anything communist. Historians have agreed that Forrestal did more to insert permanent paranoia into the United States government than any other source. In 1949, his personal paranoia overwhelmed him and he committed suicide, having said that the Reds were after him. But by then, the permanent peacetime preparedness genie was out of the bottle and Forrestal's Cold War was firmly on autopilot. And his admiring friend, Paul Nitze, was influentially carrying Forrestal's paranoid opinions 30 years forward, serving under 9 presidents, including Ronald Reagan. And military debt grew, and for every American growl, paranoid, Joseph Stalin, Leonid Brezhnev, up Soviet defenses. So our military debt increased more and more. In 1951, the national debt was a still manageable $13 billion. In 1968, we were spending over $30 billion a year on just the Vietnam War. In 2007, President George W. Bush requested a military budget of $100 billion for just 6 months. Seeking perspective, reporter Bartholomew of the Scripps Howard News Service calculated that worked out to $5,500 per second. That is, just 4 months ago, in September 2018, President Trump requested Congress to consider a military budget of $675 billion, and that is $27,000 each second. A month later, the news broke that the U.S. Treasury was intending to secure the biggest loan in history to apply to our almost $22 trillion national debt. A loan with interest. To pay on another loan with interest, senseless financial lunacy. To blow your minds more, click on website usdebtclock.org. That turbulent site will make your head spin. While you watch, our national debt increases at about $1,600,000 each minute, which is about $27,000 a second. I suggest that to gain perspective on a million versus a billion and versus a trillion, watch on that website how long it takes to grow another billion, and that it takes 15 months to make a trillion. And just remember that that is at the speed of $1.5 million per minute. That is also when it becomes clear that a trillion exceeds anybody's dimensional comprehension. How can our national leaders wrestle with this problem? 2 official statements to remember. 1, it is a big threat to the quality of life for future generations. And number 2, you, your children and your grandchildren must pay 100% of the debt by higher taxes. We keep saying we are the world's best and everything, but paying only interest has brought us nothing. You now should understand why the Economic Global Competitiveness Forum rates the United States as 37th in primary education, as 51st in science education, as 32nd in life longevity. We are not the world's best. I think that it is very improbable for us to ever eliminate the national debt. Something cataclysmic will intervene. For example, there has to be loaning individuals, companies, and foreign governments like China who need only early loan payment, repay. Our present path is straight to fiscal chaos. And with chaos will come the revolution of our angry, divided, antagonistic, uncompromising nation. Historically, a great many empires have perished in overwhelming, usually military debt. Our 242-year-old 1776 dream of a viable, smoothly functioning, compassionate democracy with a contented populace is still only a dream. What can we do? Change must start with us. There is willful blindness in silence. Any viable answer can only come from our political leaders. vigorously and furiously intensify our political action. Ask if your political leaders have ever seen this dramatically and informatively mesmerizing website, usdebtclock.org. My only solution is perhaps whittling off the top of the debt of 71 years of quadrupled taxes to neutralize the last years of abysmal fiscal neglect. I also fantasize that someone, probably young, may pluck a viable resolution spark from this simplistic commentary. But I've just found a new, exciting, realistic, hopeful website. And it's uptous.org. Come back to that in a moment. The military war, I'm sorry, that's the end of that.
With us on the program is David Meakes. He's the author of Perspective, The Golden Rule. His website is davidmeakes.com. I know that you were opposed to the Vietnam War. Tell us a little bit about that.
The Vietnam War was a prime example of a debt-building, military-wasting, dollar-wasting, life-wasting war, like we discussed in our first segment. Studies of war causes are what may avoid future bloody wars. Communism caused the massive, mighty superpower, the United States, to be defeated by the tiny, weak, remote nation of Vietnam, which had no airplanes, no ships, and no tanks. I'll say these two sentences slowly to allow understanding. The 1954 Geneva Accords was an international agreement signed by the United States, which stated that the 17th parallel across the narrow waist of Vietnam would serve as a temporary non-political line until the Civil War of North and South Vietnam was decided by their future 1956 election. However, in 1956, President Eisenhower advised South Vietnam's U.S. dependent leader, DM, to refuse elections because, he said, 80% of Vietnam would vote communist. For 4 years, 1956 to 1959, Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam's leader, appealed for those elections, but voters' choice was ignored. And in 1950, due to not letting their election settle their problem, North Vietnam's military resistance, the National Liberation Front, was formed. And 4 more years later, in 1960, 57,000 Americans and over 1 million Vietnamese were soon to die. The much-loved, influential Eisenhower's respected, never but flawed advice to thwart the election choice of all Vietnam had possibly made the Vietnam War inevitable. The insidious law of Forstall's National Security Act paranoia had prevailed on both Ike's advice and on President LBJ's war decision. Anti-communism hysteria was controlling all decisions. The anti-communism shroud had stifled rational judgment, excused erroneous decisions, and overlooked stupendous blunders, such as the war itself. It is well documented that President Kennedy would have withdrawn the American military by the spring of 1965, but President Johnson instead poured in more than 500,000 troops. So 57,000 American lives were indirectly sacrificed by the denied election, by 3 Kennedy assassination bullets, and by Forstall's paranoid America World Cup philosophy. Acknowledging failure, in 1973, the defeated Americans left Vietnam, which remained communist, and 45 years later, it still is communist. It was an utterly disgusting loss of over 1 million Vietnamese lives and over 57,000 American lives, and was an embarrassing defeat. Think of the pointless pain and family suffering in both countries. 9 years earlier, in August 1964, I had joined the Palos Verdes, California Unitarian Church protest group We organized studies, exchanged information, delegated tasks, and publicly protested. One occasion for protest was the memorial service for Florence Beaumont, and it was on the west steps of the Los Angeles Federal Building, where a few days before she had burned herself to death in sacrificial protest against the Vietnam War. Our random postcards seemed ineffectual and only intended as an opinion column, so I began my own personal persuasive postal protest, writing more than 36 letters to President Johnson and Nixon and over 100 to congressmen, senators, and other influential people. In 1958, over 50 years ago, the American death rate in Vietnam averaged much above 1,000 deaths each month. In 1987, Professor, subsequently a congressman, Walter Capps, the University of California in Santa Barbara, appeared on the CBS 60 Minutes program, where he described teaching his university course about the Vietnam War to students too young to remember. I subsequently contributed all my books, letters, their answers, and many State Department documents to the University of California in Santa Barbara. In 1996, Vietnam War CEO, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, published his second edition of the 1995 book, named In Retrospect. He included 118 pages of that 1 year of blistering media commentary and scathing criticism about his first edition's inadequate explanation and reasons for the mismanagement of the war. Using the blame-sharing pronoun we, he had placed much of the war blame on himself and on President Johnson. He voiced regret at losing the war, but I felt that he failed to express adequate regret for the lives lost on both sides. However, I viewed these critical commentaries as validating my years of Vietnam War protests.
What reasons should one consider supporting war?
I used to quip that the only things my 1940 recruiting office required was that I was volunteering and breathing. So patriotism was my 1940 reason. I am sure that recruiters prefer those who automatically say, my country, right or wrong. But for any service member, and especially for the thoughtful, conscientious individual, there should be a worthy moral goal for which to fight and die. Distrust in our nation and its goal exploded when the lies and the immorality of the Vietnam War became clear to everyone 50 years ago. Many young American conscientious objectors understood, rebelled, and rather than serve in an obviously immoral war, fled to neutral countries, most notably Canada. As the Vietnam War veterans returned, they quickly formed opposition groups against the continuing war. Wars should not be fought for money, power, religion, land, or oil, but only for defense of moral, democratic, humanitarian, golden rule reasons. With that criterion in mind, both religious and irreligious individuals could arrive at the same moral point of pro and con decision. Thinking deeply is essential. History has given us appalling descriptions of the horrors of religiously based wars, most notably the Crusades and the Holocaust. My assumption had been that that kind of apocalyptic interpretation was far in the past, but on October the 27th, 2018, an anti-Jewish zealot murdered 11 people in a Pittsburgh synagogue. When our own crude leader is publicly insulting, divisive, degrading, and derogatory of others, unstable minds can easily interpret his intolerance as tacit approval and act out their hate. Our nation is regressing. Think and speak up. Love and respect all your neighbors, no exceptions.
The book is Perspective, the Golden Rule. David Meakes, the author. What would you like to happen because of your book?
There was a psychoanalyst called Alfred Adler, and his golden rule version was there is a law that a man should love his neighbor as himself, and in a few hundred years it would be as natural as breathing or as standing erect. That is my precise hope. But most importantly, to make it an automatic and instinctive reflex, it needs teaching from childhood with increasing adult content. On through university, it should include all life's relationships, such as personal, social, sports, romance, business, military, and government. It must be developed internationally and probably taught through the United Nations. With spontaneously great international relations, wars would eventually cease, and taxes would go for education, medical care, and for social and community needs. My fervent hope is that my book might provide the inspirational spark, probably someone young again, leading up to that ultimate state of harmony. But remember, the website, us.clock.org, USDEBTCLOCK.org. And in addition, my new found friends, the Warriors Against the National Debt, and their one is itsuptous.org. It's ITSUPTOUS.org. Thank you very much.
David, thank you as always. A very interesting perspective. Years of devotion has gone into this, putting this message out. Perspective, the Golden Rule is the name of David's book. David Meakes is the author. That's MEAKES. His website is davidmeakes.com, and you can link on directly to David's website by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. David, a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for that very important message. Thank you.
And thank you so very much, Rick, for making it possible.
It was our pleasure. Once again, Perspective, the Golden Rule by David Meakes. Information available at our website, thisweekinamerica.us.